He left her when she could no longer walk, thinking she had nothing left to give. What he didn't know? She was about to inherit 100 million and rewrite her life without him. Subscribe and write in the comments. Where are you watching from? The frost still clung to the window panes of the little house at the edge of Bennington as Sarah Bennett stirred awake in the dark silence of early morning. Her alarm clock, dependable and dull, buzzed just once before she reached over and silenced it with her usual swiftness. For years, Sarah had risen at 5:30, made coffee, prepared her lesson plans, and set off for Green Meadow High School, where she taught literature to teenagers who, more often than not, only half listened. It didn't matter. She loved them anyway, and she loved her subject, and she believed deeply that books saved people. That had been enough. Sarah was the kind of woman whose presence brought a quiet sort of order to things. Not commanding, not loud, just steady. Her home was modest, painted a pale blue that looked silver in winter. With a garden out front she tended faithfully in spring. Her kitchen smelled perpetually of cinnamon and clean linen, and the bookshelves sagged under the weight of worn paperbacks and annotated classics. Her husband, Tom, had once joked that she loved Dickens more than him. She laughed at that, back then. Tom had changed, or maybe time had worn away something they both ignored. He was charming once, funny, proud, a natural storyteller who knew how to turn silence into a punchline. But after he lost his job at the dealership 2 years ago, something in him grew restless. He blamed the economy, then blamed his age, then the weather, then nothing in particular. Sarah picked up extra tutoring shifts, never complained, told herself it was temporary. She had always believed in seasons, some hard, some kind, but all passing. They still had dinners with the neighbors, hosted the annual 4th of July barbecue, and spent quiet Sunday afternoons reading in the den. From the outside, they looked content. Even Sarah sometimes believed it. But at night, when Tom fell asleep in front of the television, and she sat alone on their back porch staring at the empty swing that never had a child to fill it, she would wonder if perhaps contentment was just another word for settling. The night of the accident had been unremarkable. She'd stayed late at school for parent-teacher conferences, offering gentle reassurances to worried mothers and distracted fathers. It had rained earlier, then frozen. The roads gleamed slick beneath the streetlights. She remembers singing along to a song on the radio, tapping the steering wheel, thinking about the essay topic she wanted to assign. The truck came from nowhere. There was a blinding rush of light, the deafening sound of metal tearing, then nothing at all. When she awoke, the world was strange. The antiseptic scent of hospital corridors stung her nose. Machines blinked beside her bed, steady and indifferent. She tried to move. Nothing happened. Panic surged like fire under her skin. A nurse appeared, kind eyes, gentle voice. But the only words Sarah could focus on were the ones she didn't want to hear. Spinal damage. Permanent paralysis. Her world collapsed inward. Days blurred into nights and back again, filled with medications. Tears she tried not to let anyone see, in a quiet dread that never quite left her. She watched snow fall through the hospital window, small and constant, while Tom sat at her bedside scrolling through his phone. He said the right words, held her hand sometimes, but he always looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Discharge came sooner than she expected. The house had been retrofitted, ramps added, narrow doorways widened. The changes made it feel unfamiliar. Sarah's wheelchair squeaked on the polished floor, echoing in the silence. Tom helped at first. He made her tea, brought groceries, even tried to joke. But something hollow lingered in his tone. The weight of care began to press on him visibly. He started sleeping on the couch, then staying out later, blaming errands or chance meetings with old friends. Sarah said little. She watched it all with the quiet heartbreak of someone who has read this story before. She tried to pretend the distance wasn't growing, even as she caught the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his jacket. She still hoped, naively perhaps, that their bond would outlast her body's failure. But hope has a cruel habit of lingering where it isn't wanted. One evening, Tom came home late, visibly drunk, and didn't look at her as he passed through the living room. She asked him softly if everything was okay. He said nothing at first, then laughed bitterly. "I can't do this, Sarah. I didn't sign up for this." The words struck with the coldness of steel. He didn't need to say more. The next morning, she found his side of the closet empty. No goodbye note, no explanation. Just space. The days that followed were quiet in the most devastating way. The phone stopped ringing. Friends grew busy, unavailable. The school sent a sympathy card, then a notice that her leave had officially ended and her position was being replaced. Bills came regularly. Disability benefits trickled in, but barely covered medication, much less food or heating. Sarah began to understand the kind of loneliness that clings not to solitude, but to abandonment. The silence in the house was not peace. It was a verdict. She had been left behind, but something in her refused to give in. She adjusted to the rhythm of her new life with slow, aching grace. She learned to cook seated, to shower with assistance, to call the pharmacy herself. The body might weaken, but the will, she discovered, could harden like stone. Then came the moment that would change everything. She found the letter in her mailbox on a Thursday afternoon in early March. It was thick, crisp, the kind of envelope that carried formality and foreboding. The return address read, Aldridge Keller, New York. She opened it without thinking. The contents were both surreal and succinct. Her godfather, Gerald Morgan, had passed away in February. Though they hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years, ever since a family dispute Sarah was too young to understand, he had named her as the sole beneficiary of his estate. There were conditions, of course. She was to remain silent about the inheritance for 6 months. Any breach of confidentiality would nullify the bequest. She stared at the page, numb. At first, she suspected a scam. She called the firm, prepared to hang up at the first sign of fraud. But the woman on the other end was patient, professional, and utterly sincere. They had been trying to reach her. Gerald had specified her name clearly in his final will. The estate was large, very large. She hung up in silence and sat by the window, letter in hand, heart pounding. Outside, the first hints of spring were trying to break through the frost. Somewhere in the world, something had shifted. That night, she dreamed of the classroom, the chalkboard, the smell of old books, and a voice her own telling a class that no story ends in the middle, no matter how dark the chapter. When she awoke, the sun was pouring through the blinds. The phone didn't ring, no one knocked, but Sarah felt something she hadn't in a very long time. She felt ready. The week that followed drifted by in an odd, weightless rhythm. Sarah found herself waking each morning not in panic, not in dread, but in something else. A kind of stunned, cautious awareness. The letter from Aldridge Keller lay folded neatly in the top drawer of her nightstand, as if it might vanish if she left it visible too long. She reread it several times each day, lingering on the words sole beneficiary as though they might change their meaning in the daylight. Each time they did not. The voice of the attorney on the phone, Ms. Callahan, still echoed in her ears. Courteous but warm, she had spoken with the ease of someone used to delivering difficult truths and unexpected blessings. She confirmed that Gerald Morgan had passed away quietly in his sleep at his estate in Connecticut. No children, no surviving siblings, no named partners. Just Sarah. They offered to send a car to fetch her and bring her to the New York office for the reading of the will and official proceedings. Sarah hesitated. Travel was no longer simple. Nothing was simple, but they assured her transportation would be fully arranged, accommodation provided, and that the firm would have accessibility in mind for every detail. She had no excuse, and if she was honest, she didn't want one. On Monday morning, the car arrived, sleek, quiet, black as ink, and the driver, a kind man named Arthur, assisted her into the back seat with professional ease. As they pulled away from the curb, Sarah looked back at her little house. It no longer seemed like home. It was simply a structure filled with ghosts and bills and echoes. The ride was long, and she watched the Vermont landscape fade into something steelier and busier as they neared Manhattan. It was the first time in years she had left the state. The law offices of Aldridge Keller sat in a marble tower overlooking Central Park, with glass doors that shimmered like water. She had never imagined herself in such a place. Her world had been classrooms, county libraries, and farmers markets. Now a woman in a navy suit guided her gently into a conference room with books that looked untouched and windows that stretched across the sky. An older man entered, Mr. Porter Turner, white-haired, careful in speech, with the distinct air of someone who remembered names and never raised his voice. He shook her hand with sincerity and sat across the polished table. There were no theatrics, no dramatic flair. He opened a folder, glanced over a few lines, and looked at her with soft gravity. "Your godfather left you everything," he said. "His estate, his assets, his holdings, real estate, trusts, securities, collectibles. The full value is estimated just above $100 million. Sarah blinked. The number had no weight in her mind. It was absurd, fictional, like something overheard in a movie. She tried to speak, but failed. Her throat tightened. She had imagined a few thousand, maybe a house, maybe a dusty watch, or some stocks that meant nothing. But this, it shattered the ground beneath her. "There are conditions," he added. "He was a private man. He stipulated that the inheritance is to be kept completely confidential for 6 months. You may use a portion of it for living expenses, of course, but if news of it spreads, if anyone finds out and it can be traced back to you, the remainder is forfeited." Sarah listened, numb. The idea of anyone even knowing felt so foreign that secrecy seemed natural. "Why me?" she whispered at last. Mr. Turner smiled faintly. "He remembered you as a child, said you had a gentleness the world could learn from. And he followed your career, quietly. He was proud of the woman you became." Her hands trembled slightly on her lap. She hadn't thought of Gerald Morgan in decades, hadn't considered herself someone worth remembering, let alone blessing. But someone had been watching, someone had believed. She signed the paperwork. The firm would handle the necessary transfers with a modest advance deposited into an account she now controlled. When she left the office, the world outside felt changed. The city hummed with its usual electricity, indifferent to the fact that a woman in a wheelchair had just inherited a fortune. But inside her chest, something new began to stir. Not power, not triumph, just space. She returned to Vermont only long enough to pack what she needed. The house held nothing of value anymore. The bed she had wept in, the walls that had absorbed Tom's bitterness, the quiet kitchen with unused tea mugs, it could all go. She moved to a small apartment in Montpelier under a quiet lease, using her new funds through a trust to avoid detection. She changed her phone number, informed only the bare minimum of contacts, and vanished gently from the world that had once known her. Her days took on new shape. She found herself rising with intention. She bought a proper desk, updated her laptop, and signed up for several online teaching platforms under the name S. Bennett. Students began trickling in, young women preparing for college entrance exams, teenagers struggling with essay structure, adults working on GED requirements. Her mind reawakened. The classroom returned, but in miniature, pixelated and distant, yet no less real. With the small stipend from the inheritance, she lived comfortably for the first time in years. She hired a quiet home aide who came in the mornings to help with basic needs, then left her alone by noon. Groceries were delivered, meals became more regular, her weight stabilized, and the hollowness in her cheeks slowly faded. Still, she spoke to no one about the inheritance. One evening, she scrolled through social media, a habit she hadn't indulged in for months. There she saw the faces of single mothers, women in her own town, struggling with job loss, rent hikes, daycare closures. She remembered what it felt like to choose between food and heating. A quiet decision took root. She began sending anonymous grocery cards to local families through shelters and community centers. At first a dozen, then 20, then more. She kept the notes short. "You matter, don't give up." There were no names, no return addresses, only quiet kindness. It felt better than luxury ever could. And yet the sense that she was meant to do more lingered. Gerald hadn't simply handed her money, he had handed her responsibility. The idea for the center came slowly, like morning light breaking through fog. A place not just for charity, but for restoration. For women who had been abandoned, dismissed, written off. A home for the forgotten and the underestimated. She began drafting a plan: outreach programs, trauma counseling, legal advice, housing referrals, education tracks. The project became her anchor. She pored over architectural layouts, ADA compliance codes, nonprofit registration forms. It didn't matter that she had no background in business. She had purpose. The more she built, the more she realized how vast the need was. Calls to community leaders revealed waiting lists for shelter, a lack of support groups, overburdened food banks. She reached out to professionals discreetly under a pseudonym and recruited a team of social workers, therapists, even a retired educator who remembered Sarah from a seminar 10 years earlier. They agreed to join, drawn not by salary, but by vision. One afternoon, as she reviewed the blueprint for the center's common area, her phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She answered, hesitant. "Sarah, it's Tom." Her breath caught. "I heard you moved. People say you're doing better." He paused. "I just wanted to check on you." She said nothing. He didn't know. Couldn't know. "I was thinking," he continued. "Maybe we could talk. Start over. I know things got messy." A rush of old grief swelled, but she held firm. "I'm fine," she said. "Goodbye, Tom." She hung up. That night she sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the list of women who had already applied for help at the still unopened center. Each name a story, each story a chance. She looked around her small apartment, filled with folders, sketches, and notes. She was alone, yes, but not lost. 6 months. That was the promise. After that, the rest of the inheritance would be released. But even now, Sarah understood the real wealth wasn't in the numbers. It was in what she was building and who she was becoming. And she wasn't done yet. By the time April warmed the sidewalks and trees began to bud along the streets of Montpellier, Sarah Bennett's project had transformed from scattered sketches on her kitchen table to a near-operational community center. The building, a 2-story structure with wide doors, ample natural light, and rooms designed for safety and comfort, stood a short walk from the town's library. Her architect, a patient woman with a keen eye for warmth in public space, had taken every suggestion to heart. From the moment anyone stepped inside, Sarah wanted them to feel they mattered. The center, though still officially unnamed to preserve Sarah's anonymity, had already drawn cautious interest from local nonprofits and women's advocacy groups. Several community leaders she had spoken with over the phone, still using the name S. Morgan, a hybrid of her maiden and godfather surnames, expressed admiration for her vision, even without knowing who was behind it. Flyers had begun appearing around town, promising free legal counseling, trauma support sessions, financial literacy classes, and even safe transitional housing for women and children in crisis. The center would open its doors in just under 2 months. Sarah worked tirelessly, dividing her time between online tutoring sessions, overseeing renovations, and coordinating volunteers. Every task she completed pulled her further from the shadow of her old life and deeper into something real and lasting. Her wheelchair no longer felt like a symbol of what she had lost. It was simply how she moved through a world she was actively shaping. Still, despite her determination, echoes of the past returned, uninvited. One afternoon, as she rolled up to the main entrance of the center for a scheduled inspection, she noticed a figure waiting on the steps. At first, she thought he might be a delivery driver, perhaps early, but when he turned, her breath hitched. Tom stood there, thinner than before, the confident curve of his shoulders diminished. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw unshaven. He wore the same coat he'd once worn to parties, now weathered and stained at the cuffs. She didn't speak. He stepped forward and gave a strained smile. "Sarah," he said, the name delicate on his tongue, as if unsure he still had permission to say it. She looked past him, toward the building. She wanted to keep moving, to pretend he wasn't there, to remain composed, but too much history pressed between them. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Word gets around," he said. "People talk." Sarah could guess. Rumors had indeed begun swirling in recent weeks. No one knew the source of the funding for the center. Some speculated government grants. Others assumed a wealthy benefactor had taken pity on Montpellier. A few had guessed correctly that someone local, once quiet and unseen, had taken matters into her own hands. Tom must have heard whispers. "What do you want, Tom?" she asked, her voice steady, though her chest thudded. He rubbed the back of his neck. We've hit a rough patch. We? Me and..." He hesitated. Madeline, you remember her? Yes, Sarah remembered. Her former acquaintance. The woman Tom had run to when Sarah's body failed her. The woman who had slipped into Sarah's life with practiced ease and vanished with the same casual cruelty. She lost her job, Tom continued. We're behind on rent. Everything's falling apart. Sarah waited. I came to say I'm sorry, he added. For everything. I didn't handle it well. I see that now. I was scared and I failed you. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. I want to help, he said too quickly. I heard you have something going here. A center. A project. Maybe I could assist volunteer, or maybe even work. There it was, the plea cloaked in concern, the hook baited with regret. She looked at him for a long time. You left me when I couldn't walk, she said, the words quiet but sharp. You slept on someone else's couch while I was learning to dress myself again. You chose to disappear, and now you reappear when you think there's something in it for you. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. No, she said. What you did wasn't fair. What I'm doing now is survival. He stepped closer. You can't hold a grudge forever, Sarah. You were always better than that. I'm not holding a grudge, she said. I'm setting a boundary. She turned her wheels and rolled past him, through the doors of the center. Inside, a staff member greeted her, unaware of what had just occurred outside. Sarah forced a smile, moved through her checklist, and did not speak of the man lingering on the sidewalk. That evening, she received a message from Madeline. It was carefully worded, full of regret and justifications. She too asked for help, just until they could get back on their feet. Sarah read it twice, deleted it, and turned off her phone. In the following weeks, the center's final stages came together. The walls were painted in soft tones, the floors laid with soundproofing mats, the therapy rooms furnished with cozy chairs and warm lighting. Donations of clothing, school supplies, and books began pouring in after Sarah anonymously reached out to a handful of larger organizations. Volunteers, many of them women who had once needed help themselves, began training. Every inch of the building carried Sarah's invisible signature. Then came the letter. Stamped with Aldridge Keller's seal, it arrived one spring morning. Sarah opened it slowly, her hands unsteady. The final disbursement was complete. The full inheritance, $100 million, diversified, protected, and now wholly hers. She sat in silence for almost an hour after reading it. The number no longer made her tremble, but the weight of what it could do, that still made her breath short. She thought of Gerald. She hoped he would be proud. She closed her eyes and said thank you. That weekend, she invited her small team of staff and volunteers to a quiet dinner at the center. Nothing grand, just long tables, home-cooked dishes, and candles in jars. She rolled between the tables, thanking each person for their courage, their presence, their belief in what could be built from ruin. She felt for the first time in years, not just alive but belonging. A few days later, the local paper asked to interview her. The journalist had heard about the center through a school counselor. Sarah agreed. She told the truth, not about the inheritance, but about her injury, the betrayal, the rebuilding. She spoke of how she had felt invisible, discarded, and how she wanted to create a place where no woman ever felt that way again. The article spread quickly. People wrote letters, some mailed handmade cards. One woman dropped off a bouquet of daffodils with a note, "You reminded me I matter." One afternoon, as she organized a new delivery of supplies in the main lobby, she looked up and saw Madeline standing in the doorway. She held a baby on her hip. Her eyes were sunken, her posture apologetic. "I didn't come to ask for money," she said, as if she'd rehearsed the line. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. We were cruel. I was afraid. I envied you." Sarah didn't reply. She watched the baby's little fingers clutch at Madeline's sweater. "I don't expect anything," Madeline added. "Just wanted you to know." Sarah considered her. The bitterness had faded from her heart, replaced by clarity. She nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Madeline left quietly. Days turned into weeks. The center opened its doors officially, with a modest ribbon cutting and speeches by the mayor and school board. Sarah didn't speak. She stood at the edge, hands in her lap, eyes shining. Women came hesitant at first, then steady. Some carried infants. Some had bruises. Some simply had silence. Each was met with dignity. Each found a space that did not judge. Michael, a quiet man who had helped design the center's website, began stopping by more frequently. He brought her books he thought she'd like, shared soup recipes, and always laughed at her dry jokes. One evening after a long day, they sat on the back steps of the center watching the sunset. He reached over and gently touched her hand. "You built this," he said. "You turned heartbreak into shelter." She smiled and didn't pull away. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Tom never returned. The last she heard, he had moved to another state. Madeline, she learned through a colleague, had found work at a local daycare and no longer asked for help. Sarah harbored no resentment. Their roles in her life were closed chapters. One morning, as she made her tea and looked out the window of her modest apartment, she felt peace. Not the kind that arrives with revenge or validation, but the kind born of purpose. She had been discarded, yes, but she had not been defeated. And now she was free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.